And we have a strict zero tolerance policy for any heckling or disruption. And now, please welcome host of the Rubin Report, Dave Rubin.
You guys know about Jordan, right? Wow. Holy cow, what is going on here in Salt Lake City? I've been here for 2 days. You are the happiest people I've ever seen in my life. I have never seen that. First off, you have the most beautiful city I've ever seen. This theater is by far the most incredible place we've been to on the tour. Everything's clean, you're smiling, you all look good. Why are you telling more people about this? You don't want them to come. All right, I get it. What? This is just incredible. I did stand up last night at Wise Guys. I think some of you were there, right? I've never seen a more bananas crowd in my life. You guys are incredible. So this is, it's General Conference is happening right now, right? I mean, I knew coming to Salt Lake City I was going to see Mormons. I didn't realize you guys were going to be like multiplying. I threw water on some Mormons. More Mormons showed up. You guys just did something really interesting. We've done about 50 some odd shows so far. I think you're the first crowd that actually applauded the no heckling sign. Did you guys that? Yeah, like, we like free speech, but not when Jordan Peterson is talking. Wow, this place is incredible. There is so much good energy just happening. Can you guys feel it, that there is something good happening right now? There really is something happening, and I think this whole intellectual dark web is right at the center of it. You guys, are you on board with the dark web? I feel like you guys will applaud anything pretty much. You're very... They will applauding. Okay, that's pretty good. But there really is something beautiful happening. You know, what we've sort of honed in on here is that it's not about the diversity meme that we've been sold about skin color and sexuality and gender. Okay, fine, nobody cares about that. It's about diversity of ideas, right? I think you guys know that. And that's the beautiful thing that we've got going in the IDW. I think that's why you guys are watching us. And we've got people on the left like Sam Harris. We've got people on the right like Ben Shapiro. They love Ben Shapiro. Everywhere we go, a 4'7" Orthodox Jew gets huge applause. That was a joke. He's 4'9". But yeah, we got Harris on the left, we got Shapiro on the right, now we have our new leader, Kanye West. So, we've got everybody. How's it going up there? How you guys doing up there? I feel like I'm in a spaceship. This is awesome. I should tell you guys, as you know, one of the rules is, one of the 12 rules, of course, is not to lie, so I do feel like I have to get something off my chest before we start here. I was actually not Jordan's first choice to open for him on the tour. Yeah. It was Kathy Newman, and he asked her to open, and she was like, "So you're saying you want to sleep with me?"
So what you're saying is...
guys are nuts, and you're doing this without caffeine mostly, right? I don't understand what's going on here. It's nuts. There's a lot happening. There really is something beautiful happening. But it's funny because we're traveling the country. And as I said, we've done about 50 stops. We've got about 20 stops coming out in Europe over the next couple weeks. And every day, there's another hit piece written about Jordan while we're doing this. So we meet thousands of you guys, great people, and then just every article is just another crazy thing. You saw the big one, of course, a couple weeks ago, New York Times. Jordan is for enforced monogamy. Which sounds very scary, but it's just marriage, people. That's it. And yes, it can be quite horrific, but you know, we thought we have to embrace it. You know what I mean? If they're going to keep writing these pieces, it's like we should embrace it, we should incorporate it into the show. So we thought tonight that maybe we'd enforce a little monogamy here. How does that sound to you good people? Okay? I had a feeling you were going to applaud that. All right, so now the thing is, the audience is here. Well, how many single people do we have, first off? Let's see how many single people. Okay, all right, we got some single people. Now, the thing is, of course, that the audiences skew a little male to female. It's usually like 60-40 male to female. So we may have to enforce some gay monogamy. Is that cool? I got one guy.
Go for it, Dave.
Oh, okay, we got somebody else. Very exciting. Man, you guys are really bananas. I don't get it. Like, I can feel something in this room right now. It's crazy. All right. How many of you clean your room today? I like people that raise their hand, like, very respectfully. I clean my room. I
thought
wrestle the
about making my
lobster, I
bed.
clean my room.
I didn't have to.
I did everything.
We had the
you're
hotel
supposed to
do it.
All right. You guys almost ready for a Jordan Peterson? What do you think? I think you're ready. All right, I want to do one more thing with you before I bring Jordan up here. So when we started this tour, it was about 4 months ago, we started in Jordan's adopted hometown of Toronto, and someone tweeted me something right at the beginning of the show that I think kind of captures exactly what's going on here and why you guys are here. Now normally, of course, when I open up Twitter, it's a pink anime fox telling me to go fuck myself, but this... Yeah, we have some pink anime foxes here, don't we? I dropped the F-bomb there. I wasn't sure on you guys. Huh? Okay, all right. So this guy, his name's Immeasurable Matt on Twitter. He takes a picture of him and his girlfriend or his wife, and they're in the crowd with all these other people. And, whoops, I just lost the picture. There we go. And this is what he wrote. He said, "It's wild to be sitting in a sold-out venue with 1,000 other people waiting to listen to Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin, when in my daily life, I act like a secret agent and tiptoe around even mentioning Jordan Peterson's name." Look around, guys. You see what's going on here? This is real. It's happening. There's something happening. It really is, and you know, most revolutions are bloody, but if we do this one right, it won't be bloody because we'll win it with ideas. And the guy I'm about to bring onto stage is at the center of the right ideas. So go completely bananas. For Jordan Peterson, everybody. Jordan Peterson!
quite remarkable. We have a lovely city here. I drove up with my wife today to Park City. That was quite the cliffy road. It was beautiful. We were driving into winter though, and that's never a good thing for a Canadian. Yeah, it's really very impressive, and I'm very happy to be here. You have a lovely auditorium, and there's so many of you, and so, well, hooray for all that, as far as I'm concerned. So, I've been sitting backstage thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about, and I thought I'd tell you what I've been trying to do for so long, and I'll tell you how this all started. So, 12 Rules for Life, which is the nominal title for this talk, is a reasonably accessible book. It's taken me about 30 years to distill what I've been thinking about to something that's more easily communicable. I don't know how easily communicable it is yet, but it's getting there. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how it all came about. I was thinking about this line today. I think I was thinking about it because of the Cavanaugh hearings and because of everything that's been going on, all the destabilization that seems to be characteristic of the political dialogue right now. And, you know, when times are unstable, then you look for bedrock, and maybe you wonder, you look for bedrock, but you're not necessarily convinced that bedrock exists. And I guess that's really what I've been curious about my whole life, is whether or not bedrock exists. You know, I looked up the Declaration of Independence tonight, just the first couple of lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's an interesting line. One of the things that my book has been criticized for is its self-evidence. There's all these rules, and people who have been not very happy with me have referred to them as rather banal. It's not like I didn't know that when I wrote them. You know, I mean, I knew that they were ideas that everybody already had. They're self-evident. But sometimes you forget what's self-evident, and you start to question it. Then you have to figure out why it's self-evident again. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what does it even mean for something to be self-evident? Because it's not obvious, right? You could put any set of propositions forth as self-evident, hypothetically, but there are a set of propositions that everyone shared enough so that you could found your country on them. You know, and they weren't originated in the United States. They were the consequence of much work that had been done before in places like Britain, and then much work that had been done before that across the West, and then much work that had been done before that, reaching back into dim prehistory, trying to sort out what might constitute fundamental truth. They're deep. That's why they're self-evident. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, those might be self-evident propositions, but they're by no means bloody obvious, that's for sure. Because it isn't obvious at all what you mean when you say all men are created equal, because wherever you look, what you see is vast variety in the nature of human beings. Not only in what they're capable of, what they're endowed with, let's say, what they accomplish, but also what they glean or gather as a consequence of their labors. Inequality seems to be the rule. And it certainly was the rule in societies. It was the rule, and I would say celebrated rule, the rule of inequality. It was celebrated prior to the emergence of this set of ideas that's laid out in such an articulate manner in the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't like aristocrats back in aristocratic society were upset about the fact that they were aristocrats. They felt that was a perfectly reasonable reflection of the natural order. So it's not obvious at all what it means that all men are created equal. And it's certainly not obvious what it means that we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, unalienable rights. And so hold that in mind for a moment. So back in the late 1970s, when I wasn't very old then, I was about 17 or 18, I had, you know, for those of you who are old enough to remember, you know, the Cold War really heated up in the early 80s, right up to really peaked. There was a peak in 1962, 63, something like that, 62 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That wasn't good at all. Then there was another peak around 1984 during the Reagan years. There was a lot of tension leading up to that 1984 period. And when I grew up, many of the people that I grew up with, and I'm sure you all remember this, were convinced, really, in a deep sense, and perhaps they used this as an excuse not to engage themselves in life as much as they might have, but they were convinced that the probability that we were going to see the year 2000 without a Third World War was pretty damn low. And it looked like that was true because ever since the end of World War II, all that had happened was that the Soviet Union and the United States, although I blame it primarily on the Soviet Union, were building these massive nuclear arsenals of incredibly powerful weapons, and well, you tend to use weapons that you create, especially when you create tens of thousands of them. And you know, I don't know how many of you know this, but probably some of you do. You know, of course, the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was an atomic bomb. It was a fission bomb, and it was the most powerful explosive device that had ever been invented or utilized up to that point by an order of magnitude, I believe. Perhaps more than that. You know that a hydrogen bomb, which was the next class of weapon, uses a fusion bomb as its trigger. So atom bombs were something, fission bombs were something, but hydrogen bombs were something completely other. And we had lots of them, we still have lots of them. Although it doesn't look like we're quite as inclined to use them, thank God. Maybe by accident. You know, that's what it seems like now, is that if something like that happens, the highest probability is accidental right at the moment. So that was the milieu that I grew up in. I don't know why, I mean, most of the people I knew were disturbed by that, but it really disturbed me. I'm not sure why, because who knows the mysteries of our own minds. We don't know why we're interested in the things we're interested in. That's something that's worth thinking about, you know. If you're interested in psychoanalytic thinking, part of the reason I got interested in psychoanalytic thinking because I realized that we didn't control what we were interested in, right? It's very strange to think about that. You know, if you're going to school, for example, and you have an exam and you need to study it because you need to get the grade, and you think the grade is important and the course is important and maybe the rest of your life hinges on it, that doesn't mean that knowing all that is going to make you buckle down and study or be interested in the content. And it's so strange, because you think with all that laying on the line, you just automatically gravitate towards opening up your books and studying like mad, but you don't. And that's interesting. That's really interesting, because that's one of the things that indicates that you have a nature, right? That you're not your own slave, and you're not your own master, and you're not something that can be arbitrarily shaped easily, or shaped either, and certainly not shaped easily. You can't even tell yourself what to do, let alone have someone else tell you what to do. And you think, well, what is it in you that doesn't allow you to tell yourself what to do, even when you're working, at least in principle, in your own best interest? And you think that thoroughly. It's like, well, there's you. You're there. You're something. You know, and you're not subject to the whims of your own will. And that's terrifying in some sense. I mean, I think it's quite terrifying, because it means that there are things going on behind the scenes in the universe of your psyche that you do not understand at all. And it was partly why I was so attracted to the psychoanalysts, because Freud in particular was the first person to really elucidate that as an idea. I mean, it was embedded in literature before that, because people could be possessed by strange whims as far as literary creators were concerned. And there were religious ideas that were related to that too, or the ideas of possession, or in polytheistic societies, the idea that you were the pawn of multiple gods, the god of rage like Ares, the god of war, the god of lust, Venus, something like that, that these transpersonal forces could take control of you and direct your will. But it had never been really laid out in any coherent manner before Freud, who basically pointed out that you're like a loose population of spirits with something vaguely in control that you call you, but only vaguely in control. And God only knows what's going on behind the scenes. And for better or for worse, you know, I mean, it's partly problematic because you're a mystery to yourself and not subject to your own will, but it's also partly wonderful and remarkable because there's way more to you than you think or can control. So it's not like it's all bad. I was curious about what was happening in the Cold War, because it seemed to me to be the height of insanity that people would pit, human beings would pit two competing belief systems against one another, because of course that's what was happening, and then put everything on the line for it, right? Not just the present, let's say, but in the case of total thermonuclear disaster, the past and the future as well, to stake everything on this ideological conflict. I thought, well, what in the world is driving that? Why is it that people are so tied to their beliefs? And what is a belief anyways? What is a belief system? Why do people care about it? And why do we group together to protect it? Why would we fight a war to put our perspective forward? And more mysteriously, why would we risk everything to protect it? And so that was the question that I was attempting to address, have been attempting to address. And there was more to it than that, not so much a consequence of studying what happened between the Americans, say, and the Soviet Union. I mean, the West and the Soviet Union, a more accurate way of putting it. But I was also reading a lot about Nazi Germany and what happened there. It struck me at a more personal level somehow that the conflict between the communist bloc and the West seems sociological and political and economic and also psychological. But much of what I read about Nazi Germany really seemed psychological. And I was really, really interested in how people could have conducted themselves the way that the camp guards in the concentration camps conducted themselves, because by the time I was doing this reading, I was no longer naive enough to assume that those people who were the guards were somehow qualitatively different creatures than myself. I mean, that's a very horrifying realization. It's something I've been trying to teach my students for 40 years. That if you were in Nazi Germany, the probability that you would have been one of the bad guys rather than one of the good guys is statistically overwhelming. And that's a real, because one of the ideas that I kept encountering, especially with regards to what happened in Nazi Germany, was, well, we have to remember what happened so we don't repeat it. And I thought, by then I also knew something about memory, and I thought, well, you can't remember something you don't understand. If you don't know the moral of the story, you can't remember. What are you supposed to remember? Don't do it. Well, don't do what? Exactly. Because if you can't figure out, this is a real clinical truism. If you get involved in something bad and you don't know how you got involved, then you haven't processed the event. You haven't extracted out the wisdom from the event. You don't know how to avoid it in the future. And I didn't see any evidence whatsoever that we'd figured out what had happened in Nazi Germany. Crimes of obedience. Everyone followed the leader. It's like, no, I don't buy it. Well, why would everyone follow the leader? That's the first question. So it's not much of an explanation anyways. I actually don't think that's what the data suggest. I think when you look at a system like Nazi Germany or the Soviets, the Stalinist Soviet Union, the Soviet Union period for that matter, it's not corruption at the top and innocent people all the way down to the bottom. It's no bloody way, man. The corruption is at every single level of the hierarchy of society, right down to the bottom. And it's there equally across the entire structure. In Eastern Germany, 1/3 of people were government informers. So if you have a family of 6 people, then 2 of them were government informers. I mean, you don't get to there by obeying the leaders, even though I know that once these totalitarian systems start, the pressure to obey the leaders becomes increasingly overwhelming, and you can get tangled up in that and not be able to escape, maybe even regardless of your own personal ethic. That's a complicated question, but, that's widespread corruption when 1 out of 3 people is a government informer. I mean, that's not the top-down mediated obedience of millions of innocent people. That's collaboration on the part of everyone. So, and everyone means you. And so when I read about what happened in Nazi Germany and what happened in the Soviet Union, I thought, that's me. That's the thing about history. It's something I try to tell my students. Why should you learn history? Well, because you're a historical creature. History is about you. And you look in the past and you see all the things that people have done. You think, well, I'm a person. I've done that. I mean, I know that you have to separate yourself out as an individual in some sense from the great crimes of the past. I'm not a fan of identity politics, you know. I don't mean you bear the kind of personal responsibility for the horrors of the past that would enable someone to hold you responsible in a legal sense as if you committed the crime yourself. I think that's an absolutely pathological viewpoint. But the point is that it has something to do with capability. It's capability or temptation, something like that. When that's happened to so many millions of people, that kind of corruption, then there's a good possibility that you could fall prey to exactly the same thing if the circumstances laid it out that way. And so that was very frightening to me. And you know, and it was more frightening too, because one of the things I also came to understand is that it isn't obvious that the people who did the terrible things that occurred in Nazi Germany, let's say, didn't do it with some substantial amount of satisfaction. So not only can you do those things, but you can convince yourself that you're acting morally while you're doing them. So that's a nasty little twist right there. And you can also enjoy it. So that's dark. That's very dark, and it is dark. This sort of thing. It really is. You know, sometimes people get post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, that actually damages you psychophysiologically, damages you neurologically. You can be subject to a shock of such magnitude that your brain undergoes permanent structural changes. And so what happens if you develop post-traumatic stress disorder is a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is like a really important part of your brain. It moves attention from short-term memory to long-term storage. So it's like a crucial part of your brain, very metabolically active, very easy to damage as a consequence of oxygen deprivation and so forth. It's a very metabolically active area of the brain. It also stores memories before they become permanent. So, you know, if you drink too much and you can't remember what you did, the reason for that is that alcohol shut down your hippocampus, so you're not moving information from short-term attention into long-term storage. And so, anyways, if you develop post-traumatic stress disorder, your hippocampus shrinks and another brain area called the amygdala grows. And the amygdala is responsible for many things, as are all brain areas, but one of the things it's responsible for is determining the intensity of negative emotion. And so what can happen is if you're shocked badly enough, then the part of you that keeps track of your memory shrinks, and the part of you the memories that you've derived from what you've actually done in your life, that shrinks and the amygdala grows. And when you recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, the hippocampus can grow back. It's actually one of the things that antidepressants facilitates, is hippocampal regrowth, but the amygdala never shrinks. So once you're scared enough, that new sensitivity, that never goes away, because if you're scared enough, your brain thinks, things are a hell of a lot more dangerous than you thought. And so you better be more sensitive, and there's no messing about with this, it's permanent. And so you can recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, but you're never quite the same. How do you get post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, there's two ways. One is it helps to be naive. So if you want to facilitate the capacity to develop post-traumatic stress disorder among your children, the best thing to do is to overprotect them. So I would recommend that. You remember the Disney movie Sleeping Beauty? You know, the king and the queen, they want to have a child at the beginning, and they're trying very hard. It takes a long time, and they end up with one child. It's like the modern world, right? Because it's older parents, and they have one child, so that's one special child. And then they have a christening for the child, and they invite everyone in the kingdom except the evil queen. And then the evil queen shows up anyways, because the evil queen always shows up, whether you invite her or not. And she curses the child to death, young death, and then that's transmuted to sleeping, unconsciousness. Well, what does that story mean? It means that if you overprotect your children, then you entice them into unconsciousness, and that increases their risk of death. That's what that means, that story. So you invite the bloody evil queen into your child's life so that she can, or he can, learn to deal with it young, because that makes them strong. If you don't do that, you permanently put them at risk of wishing when they become adolescent, which is what happens in Sleeping Beauty, that they could just go to sleep and have everything go away. And there's no difference between that and the desire for suicide. You know, the desire for suicide, that's the desire for unconsciousness as an alternative to the trouble of life. So that's Sleeping Beauty. So that's a very tiny fragment of what that story means. Well, you know, one of the things that can produce post-traumatic stress disorder is an encounter with malevolence, and it can be the malevolence of someone else, like very naive people. Most people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder don't develop it because something terrible happened to them. That can happen, but it's not very common. What's more common is that they develop it because something terrible happened to them that someone intended. Right? So that's not tragedy, that's malevolence, that's evil. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is often generated as a consequence of the contact with naive people with evil. And what's even more horrifying than that is that most of the time when people develop post-traumatic stress disorder, this is especially true of soldiers, it's not because of something that they encountered that someone did to them, it's because something, they saw themselves doing something they can't believe they could do. And that's really worth thinking about. That's really worth thinking about. It means that you can come in contact with a dark part of yourself that's so dark that you damage yourself neurologically by observing it. So, and that's something. That's something. I'll tell you something complicated. Maybe I can. What's really complicated, and I don't know if I can manage it, but it's a very sideways move. But I'll tell you it anyways. So you know, there's this idea. You people are all familiar, at least to some degree, with the story of Adam and Eve in paradise. You know that Adam and Eve are unconscious to begin with. Their eyes aren't open. I assume that means unconscious. That doesn't mean they're stumbling around blind, obviously. It means something else. You know, they're not aware that they're naked. So there's some limit on their own consciousness, their own knowledge, and then they're enticed by the snake into developing somehow. They eat something that transforms them psychologically, and they become aware of their own nakedness, and they become aware of their moral. They become aware of the nature of morality as well. They become aware of the nature of good and evil, which is extraordinarily interesting idea that those two things would be tightly tied together. And maybe I'll make reference to that in a minute. Well, I will. I'll do that right now. So, it's part of the argument, I guess. So, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit that's offered by the snake, the first thing that happens is they realize that they're naked. It's a story I tell in 12 Rules. So what does it mean to realize that you're naked? Well, you can think about it fairly broadly. I mean, you think about kind of a nightmarish situation. It's actually a relatively common nightmare. Imagine that you're up on stage before a whole array of people and you're naked. Okay, that's quite a common fear, actually. And so what does it mean? It means, well, your physiological vulnerability is exposed to the judgment of the crowd. That's really what it means. And so to know you're naked means to become aware of your own insufficiencies, your own biological insufficiencies, and also to become aware of how that looks to the crowd. Something like that. And that's why, you know, if you do technical analysis of emotions that are associated with self-consciousness, the emotions are all negative. So to be self-conscious is to be anxious and afraid and ashamed. You think, well, we wouldn't give up self-consciousness because it's a wonderful gift. It's like, yeah, fair enough, but it doesn't matter. When you become self-conscious, well, no, you know what that's like. You tell people, well, I went out to make a speech and I became all self-conscious. It's like, well, you turn red and you kind of want to shrink away. And so even though you wouldn't give up your self-consciousness because it's such a gift, it identifies you as an individual, maybe it enables you to protect yourself. It's not like it's pleasant when it manifests itself. Anyway, so Adam and Eve become self-conscious. They realize they're naked. They clothe themselves. But at the same time, they are granted the knowledge of good and evil. And man, I tell you, I puzzled over that for like 20 years. I thought, what the hell does that mean? There's a rule in stories. And the rule is that if thing A happens and then thing B happens, they're connected causally. Because why would you juxtapose them otherwise? You know, there's some logic behind it, because otherwise the story wouldn't make sense. And apparently that story makes sense because we've been telling it for like, who knows how long. A long, long time. Well, if you become aware of your own vulnerability, then you know how you can be hurt. Right? Now, animals can be hurt, but it's not like they know how they can be hurt. They can just be hurt. Well, then you take a step past that, say out of the unconsciousness of the animal, and you become self-conscious and think, well, I can be hurt. Well, then what happens is like, oh, okay, here's an array of ways I can be hurt. That's a direct consequence of me understanding my vulnerability. What's the next step? You can be hurt, and I know how to do it. Because everything that would hurt me, which I'm now aware of, being aware of my vulnerability, I can direct against you. And that's how knowledge of good and evil enters the world, in association with knowledge of nakedness. As soon as you know your limitations and the price you pay for them, then you can inflict them on others. And as soon as you have that capacity to do that, and that's not the same as the predatory capacity of an animal. You know, a lion will take down a wildebeest, but it just does that to eat it. That's all, you know, and it's not like it's pleasant, but it's not like it's malevolent. The lion isn't doing it to torture the wildebeest. It's doing it so it can live. Well, human beings, we're in a completely different category, because we can use our knowledge of pain and suffering to inflict pain and suffering, and as soon as we're capable of doing that, then we have moral knowledge, and then the idea of good and evil enters the world. Well, let me see now. Here's the connection that I wanted to make between that whole story and what I was telling you. I mentioned before that if you want to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, that first it's good to be naive, but second it's good to watch yourself do something terrible. So and what that means is that you have the capacity within you to do things that are so terrible that if the situation demands them, that if you watch them, it will damage you to see them. And that's really something. You think, okay, well, what does that mean metaphysically? And so here's a weird twist. You can think about this. This took me about 30 years to untangle too. So, you know, there's this idea, so that there's the story of Adam and Eve and the snake. And the snake is set at odds with Adam and Eve at the end of the story. God tells the snake that Eve's descendants will bruise its head. So there's enmity between the snake and human beings. But really, in that story, there's no indication of anything particularly metaphysical about the snake. I mean, it's a creature in the Garden of Eden. It seems somewhat like other creatures, although it's got this tempting quality. But what happens is that story travels through time, as it develops across time, is that this strange idea emerges that the snake in the Garden of Eden is also Satan. And that's one of those ideas that it's either insane, because it's such a crazy idea, or there's something to it that's really profound and deep that's not obvious on the surface. And when I see an idea that's lasted for a very long period of time, I tend to think that there's something to it. Like there's at least something that gives it power, or it would be forgotten, right? And then this isn't just some story. This is a story that's had an effect on all sorts of other stories. Like it's a major league story. It's part of the battle between good and evil. And that's a fundamental story, the battle between good and evil. It might be the fundamental story. It might be the fundamental reality of life. In fact, I think it probably is. So why this association between the snake that produces self-consciousness and the king of all evil? Why would that exist as a psychological concept, let's say, independently of its metaphysical reality or lack thereof? The snake is a kind of predator. And one of the things that the entire... Okay, here's why I'm telling you all this, at least in part. I told you I wanted to talk to you about the structure of belief systems, and I wanted to talk to you about what self-evidence meant. And one of the propositions that I've been working on for a very long time, it's partly nested in the psychoanalytic ideas, is that the way we look at the world is nested inside something that's like a dream or a story. And the reason that we can say some things are self-evident in that articulated manner is because we take the platform, this would be the Constitution in this case, it would literally be that. Say, well, here's the Constitution, and it depends on certain axiomatic statements, that's what's self-evident. But the self-evidence is predicated on something else. It's nested in something, and what the self-evidence is nested in is something like a dream or a story. And the self-evidence that underlies our culture is nested in this underlying dreamer story that takes a religious form. And that's articulated to the degree that we've been able to articulate it in the stories, for example, that are part of the biblical corpus. So it's like the dream that sits underneath our culture. Now you might think, well, we don't need a dream to sit under our culture, but it doesn't look like that's how the world works, because you need to have a dream that sits under you. Because if you're deprived of dreams for 2 weeks, you'll lose your mind. You can't tolerate that. Your articulated self has to immerse itself in the world of dreams every night, or you'll lose your mind. Now, we don't know why that is exactly, but we know that it is. And so we do know that your consciousness, as it's articulated, has to be nested in this unarticulated, dreamlike surround in order for it to be able to maintain its integrity. And the psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung as well, believed that the same relationship between waking consciousness and the relationship between waking consciousness and the dream was the same as the relationship between articulated cultural knowledge and the religious substructure. Now, Jung took that farther than Freud. Freud touched on it with his Oedipal complex, which is a mythological idea, but Jung took that much further. And I think that that's true. I think what he said was true. And okay, so I'm trying to take apart what it is that makes us think that self-evident things are self-evident, so that we can know that now and understand it instead of letting it merely remain self-evident. The reason I was trying to do that was when I was working on this problem of the Cold War, I thought, well, okay, look, we've got this one system over here on the left, the communist system, and we've got this other system over here on the right, so to speak, and one is a free market, individual sovereign, democratic system that emerged out of the Judeo-Christian ethic and was transformed to some degree by the Enlightenment. That's one system. And then the other system is whatever it was that the communists erected their system on. And that was like a rationalist philosophy that was constructed in large part in the late 1800s. Said, well, what was this war about? Was it just a war between two arbitrary games? Equally arbitrary, right? It was game A or game B. And game A could have been right, and game B could have been right. And who the hell's to say? And maybe there's 3 other games that we could have been playing instead, and they could have all gone to war too. And in a morally relativistic universe, there's no distinguishing one of the games from the other. That's possible. Well, that's what I was curious about. It's like, what was this? Just a matter of opinion? This war? Or was there something deeper at stake? Like, were the presuppositions that the Marxists brought to bear to transform the world that were put into practice in the Soviet Union, Maoist China, another perfectly reasonable set of propositions? They sounded good, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Jesus, it sounds good, you know? So what happens if you put it into practice? Well, maybe you should. Maybe it's preferable to we hold these truths to be self-evident. Who knows? No one, obviously, because that's why we had to have a whole war about it and put the whole planet at risk. It's like, so I was interested in analyzing that. It's like, okay, was this just arbitrary opinion, or was there, I didn't believe it really, but I didn't know, or was there something going on in the West, or perhaps in the Soviet Union, that was deeper than mere opinion? And so that was part of the investigation into what constituted self-evidence. And that's what took me into the rabbit hole underneath, the rabbit hole of structures that are underneath normal consciousness, let's say, and down into the realm of whatever it is that we ground what we hold self-evident to be. Back to the snake story. Definitely need to drink some water before I do that again. We live in these little conceptual worlds. They're like walled gardens. They're partly a creation of nature and partly a creation of culture. So walled garden is a good metaphor, and that's what paradise means. Paradise means walled garden. And so we do live in walled gardens. That's a good way of thinking about it conceptually. And something can pop up inside the walled garden that's disruptive. And it does always, because you bound bound a space, you know, and you try to keep what you don't want in that space out, but it's really hard to keep it out. It comes in, and it's because it's very hard to separate something from everything else. You know, like, here's an example. Maybe you have some kids, and you want to protect them from the internet. And you know, you can understand why you might want to do that. And so you try to protect them from the internet, but you find that because the culture has made the internet so pervasive that in order to protect it from them, you're trying to protect them from danger, right? You have to ramp up your surveillance of them to an incredible degree. And then as you try more and more to protect them from the internet, and you become that protective force, but you drive yourself to be more and more aware of absolutely everything they do and keep them under surveillance all the time to protect them, then you become exactly the thing that you're trying to protect them against. Right. You see what I mean, is that it's not easy to keep that sort of danger away. You know, and something that wants to protect you too much can become your worst enemy. And so that's a good example of how difficult it is to parcel off a bounded space without letting something that isn't supposed to be in there come in. And I think that's why in the story of Adam and Eve, one of the things you ask yourself is, well, what the hell's up with God and the snake? It's like, he's God after all. He made paradise. Why do you have to put a snake in there? And the answer might be, you can't make a walled garden without having a snake in it. It's just not possible. Like, there can't be everything, and then a little piece of everything that's completely walled off from the rest of the everything. That doesn't work. It comes in, inevitably. And, well, that's why you can't overprotect your children, as far as I'm concerned. You can't make a safe space for your children, because they're in the world. Even if they're in your house, it's still the world. And no matter what you do, it's still the world. You're not going to get rid of the things that come in. You're not going to get rid of the things under their bed, or in the closet, or lurking in the playground, or lurking in you. And that's the relationship between the snake and Satan himself. That's the relationship, is that there's a thing that lurks and comes in. You say, well, then you might ask yourself, what's the ultimate thing that lurks and comes in? So what's the ultimate disruptor? That's another way of thinking about it. And one way of thinking about it is that it's something as mundane as something we're afraid of physically. We're afraid of snakes, for example. It's something that mundane. You think, well, that's the source of disruption. That's the source of evil. It's like, well, wait a second. It's not a sophisticated enough way of looking at it. You might think, it's not the snake, it's the place that snakes come from. And you get rid of the snake and you get rid of the place that snakes come from. But then you're still stuck with other people, let's say. And they have their own problems and troubles and their own potential for malevolence. So there's snakes that inhabit them, let's say, from a psychological perspective. And so then you protect yourself from all other people. And you wall yourself off and you try to make a space where none of that can come to get you. And then you find out that you have exactly the same problem inside you. And so that's why that idea emerged. It was a psychologization of the idea of the intrinsic threat that lurks in bounded spaces. It's like, what's the threat? Well, maybe it's a predator. It's like, well, that's not good enough. Maybe it's other people, because they can be terrible predators, worse than any other sort of predator. Yeah, fair enough. So you protect yourself from other people. Not good enough. Not good enough. There's still a predator in your own heart. And it's really there. And so, well, how do you know it's really there? Because if you encounter it, it can damage you. It will damage you. That's how you know it's there. Well, that's what I was trying to figure out when I was reading about the camp guard, say, in Auschwitz. It's like, okay, well, there's the Auschwitz guard, and isn't he terrible? It's like, yeah, for sure. And didn't he come from a terrible culture? It's like, absolutely. And aren't I a lot like him? Absolutely. And so that makes the threat, that makes the threat worse, because it's no longer outside. It's no longer something you can point at and dismiss. You have to say, no, I'm carrying that around with me. And so then I thought, well, well, then how do you constrain that? That's the next question. What do you do about that? What do you do about that? That's when I realized, I think, or I realized at least for me, that the problem of Auschwitz and the problem of the gulags in the Soviet Union wasn't political or economic or sociological. It was psychological. And it was part, in this perverse way, in some sense, it was part of the battle that Solzhenitsyn described. He said, the line between good and evil doesn't run between political parties, say, or between tribes of people. It runs down everyone's heart. And I think that that's also the theme of great literature, because when you read a great literary work, what you see is conflict within characters, not between them. You see it between them as well, but it's got to be within them, or it's not realistic. It's like, well, all those people are the bad people, and all these people are the good people. It's like, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Then even if you do get rid of all the bad people, which you can't, by getting rid of them, you're no longer one of the good people, generally speaking. And then you're also stuck with the probability that you haven't dealt with the problem. You're stuck with the problem that you haven't dealt with the problem. It doesn't work that way. And so there's this ancient idea that's part of this understructure that we regard as self-evident, that we each have a moral duty to constrain the malevolence that exists within ourselves. And I think that that's a fundamental truth. I really believe that that's a fundamental truth. I mean, that's a large part of the reason why I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, but also 12 Rules for Life, was to say, look, you got to take this problem seriously. If you want to set things up so the horrors of the past do not repeat themselves, then you have to take the problem of malevolence seriously. And the way to take it seriously is to confront it within yourself. It's not the only way to take it seriously. But all of the other ways that you would take it seriously in the absence of also doing that are not going to work. So it's part of being in this self-conscious story. That the fundamental story is something like the battle of good and evil. And it's part of being involved in that, and that is what you're involved in. That's part of what's self-evident. What we come to believe is self-evident. So that's why I've been going around talking to people about responsibility. Is that it's important to take on the responsibility for your life, because that's part of the way that you constrain the malevolence that's part and parcel of your fundamental nature. And there isn't anything that you can do that's more important than that. And I think that it's interesting because it's a religious call to action in some sense, because it's an invitation to join in the eternal battle against evil. Let's look at it that way. It's also a more believable clarion call, I think, because sometimes you're enticed into believing that you could be part of the force of good, let's say. And it's like, well, the problem with that is that it's kind of self-serving. It's easy to get tangled up in that. I think it's a lot more reliable and a lot more honest to think, no, you'd be doing pretty good if you just kept an eye on the part of yourself that was directing itself towards something approximating hell. And that would be good. And if you could manage that, well, more power to you. And you're not going to get all egotistical about that, right? You'll stay reasonably humble if that's your goal. And that's a good thing, because that's the problem with getting inflated. You think, well, I'm on the side of the good. It's like, yeah, maybe. Sometimes, if the cost isn't too high, and if enough people are watching. It's the other times that we're concerned about. And I think a lot of what's driving the polarization that's part and parcel of our dialogue right now is that kind of moral posturing on both sides. And it's one side looks at the other, and each side can point to something to blame, and often with justification. But I think as long as it's the other side, it's so tricky because it's not like we don't act politically. But I think as long as your fundamental focus is on those other people who aren't doing things right, then you're part of the problem and not part of the solution. That's how it looks to me. In Rule 6, for example, Rule 6 is a very dark rule. It's called put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And I spend a lot of time, I don't know why I was so attracted to dark things, but I certainly was. Well, God only knows why. You don't know what drives you. Maybe it's my depressive bent, who knows. But I read a lot about totalitarian states, and I read a lot about terrible people too. I mean, it's partly part of my training, right? Because I'm a clinical psychologist, and I did a lot of work on aggression. I studied aggression, antisocial behavior, criminality, alcoholism, a lot when I was in graduate school and for some time afterwards. And so I was really interested in criminal behavior and the motivations for especially psychopathic criminal acts, cruel criminal acts, school shootings and that sort of thing, serial killing, that part of the criminal spectrum that seems to, look, if someone steals your car, it's like he's actually your friend. you know, because he thinks you have a nice car, and so do you, and he thinks a car is a good thing, and so do you, and he thinks someone should own it, and so do you, but he thinks he should own it instead of you, and it's like, that's a trivial difference of opinion, man. That the guy's on your side. But when someone shoots up an elementary school, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And so those were the people that I was interested in, you know, and I wanted to know just exactly what was up with them. That's a terrible thing to want to know, because if you actually know, then you know what's up with them. If you're interested, by the way, those of you who might be interested in such things, if you want to know what motivates a rapist, for example, I have a movie you could watch. You could watch a movie called Crumb, which is like the best documentary ever made as far as I'm concerned. And it's about this underground cartoonist named Robert Crumb, who's a fairly strange character, to say the least, but he's way... No. And so I was interested in knowing, and you know, one of the things that I came to understand is that people see, this is tangled up with the other ideas that I've been talking to you about, but it's hard to make the connection. See, a lot of these connections we make with stories, and the connections are there, but we don't understand them, and the reason we don't understand them is they're too damn complicated. That's why we still have them in stories. They're so complicated, the only way we can understand them is stories. We're not smart enough to get them to be fully articulated. You know, you can find most of Freud in Shakespeare, but it's not explicit. It's still people acting it out. It's not someone saying, well, here are the rules. This is why King Lear acts the way he does. He just acts. And it makes sense in a narrative sense, and you can grasp it, but you can't consciously articulate the relationships. And the thing about these profound stories that our culture's nested in, these ancient religious stories, is that they contain truths that are unutterably profound. But that's the problem. They're actually unutterably profound. So back to these relationships are drawn, but it isn't necessarily the case that we can understand them. I've just lost my train of thought for a second here. I've been running lots of trains simultaneously. Some of them have gone astray. So, I say now I'm becoming self-conscious, which is a terrible thing to have happen. So I was talking about responsibility and self-evidence. Yes, that's exactly it, and about the necessity for us to start to awaken to these sorts of things. So back to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So one of the propositions that I was laying out before you was a bit of an explanation of what constitutes self-evidence. Self-evidence occurs when your articulated representation makes reference to shared stories. And so it's self-evident because the story is shared, and so everyone knows the story, and if you make reference to the story, then people understand it. And so you've got the grounds for self-evidence. And one of the points I was trying to make tonight is that part of what's self-evident is everyone's capacity for malevolence, and that capacity is very, very deep. So that's, and you know this, you kind of know this already. I can tell you how you know. I mean, you hold each other culpable for your actions and inactions, that's partly it. You hold yourself culpable for that, even if you don't want to, and even if you defend yourself with all sorts of rationalizations, it tends not to work very well. So you know when you've wandered off the path, and you're likely to flagellate yourself even more intently than is absolutely necessary, even though you might not want to. You know, you wake up at 3 in the morning and sweat away because of something that's happened, and you feel terrible about it because, well, you've wandered off the path and you know it perfectly well. So we all know these sorts of things. That's part of what makes us equal, right? Because that's the part of the self-evidence. It's like, well, what's this equality? Well, it's some nature that we share. And that proclivity towards malevolence is part of that nature. That's, one of the ideas that's really taken a tremendous amount of criticism in recent years is the idea of original sin. And it's not surprising that idea has been criticized, because it's not a very pleasant idea, right? that we're each inherit some flaw, that's traced back to Adam. That's the narrative representation of that idea. But well, people act that way. I mean, the environmentalists, speaking broadly, who aren't generally, they're not in the same conceptual universe, say, as the fundamentalists. They're not into the whole original sin thing, generally speaking. But they certainly believe that there's something about people that is polluting the planet. And all I see in that is a re-representation of the idea of original sin. There's something intrinsically wrong with us, and the way we're manifesting that is by ruining the planet. It's the same idea. I don't think you can get away from the idea. I think that no matter which way you turn politically or conceptually, you carry along the shadow of the idea of original sin because because you're stuck with exactly what the story of Adam and Eve tells you that you're stuck with, which is an inalienable sense of your own vulnerability, knowledge of your own fragility and subjection to anxiety and pain, and the ability to produce that in others, which is equivalent to moral knowledge. And as soon as you have that, well then you're in the realm of, for lack of a better word, and there isn't a better word, you're in the realm of sin instantly, and there's no way around that. Like, you're there, and that's that, and it's permanent, and that's part of what makes us equal. And so that's it's a very dark thing, but it's a very interesting thing. But it's a strange thing, because obviously in that initial opening statement, the idea of being equal is also something very positive, because it's partly associated with the idea of unalienable rights, and then that gives rise to the whole constitutional framework, and then this domain of freedom that all of you people, and me as well, being Canadian in part, roughly speaking, of the same system, we all cherish to a greater or lesser degree and appreciate. So the idea of equality can only be something as negative as I've laid out. I've just been talking to, about a week ago, I talked to Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, and they just wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And I would recommend that book. It opens with an interesting argument. It's really sad that they had to make the argument, in my estimation. So Lukianoff, who's one of the authors, was very depressed, and he went for cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the variants of psychotherapy, and there's a number of variants, but they share fundamental assumptions. They share self-evident truths. That's what makes them all forms of psychotherapy, actually. And one of them is that you should get your story together. That's one. We'll just leave, and I guess that's partly what we're doing tonight, is trying to get our story together at a very deep level. And another is that as you move towards the things you value in your life, you're going to encounter obstacles that you need to overcome that frighten you or otherwise make you want to avoid them. And fear would be anxiety, pain, disgust, frustration, grief, disappointment, the whole panoply of negative emotions. You encounter things in the world that are contaminated with negative emotion, and maybe you have to confront them, because otherwise you'll be stopped, but you don't want to for obvious reasons, because it frightens you or makes you angry or tears you apart or makes you grieve or makes you lose something you value. Who knows? But that's life. And one of the things that Haidt and Lukianoff have been pointing out is that if you go in for cognitive behavior therapy, what people do is they help you specify your aim, your goal, which is a good thing, to specify a goal, and then to find out what you're avoiding doing in relationship to that goal because you're afraid, and then doing an analysis of the fears and breaking them down into manageable steps, and then confronting the fears. And that's what makes you better. And every psychotherapist knows this. Absolutely every psychotherapist who isn't a complete fraud knows this. And that's not a contentious statement. There isn't that many things that psychotherapists have discovered and agree upon. One of them would be, get your story together, about your past, about your present, about your future. The second is, if there's an obstacle in your way that you have to overcome to proceed, then face it voluntarily, and that will be curative. And so Lukianoff points out that what they're teaching in universities is exactly the opposite of what mental health professionals would teach if they were trying to make strong people. Exactly, precisely the opposite. And that's true. And I was actually quite ashamed in some sense to have read that. First of all, because, well, Lukianoff had only had cognitive behavioral therapy. He wasn't a therapist. And it was up to him to point out that this was the case. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has also pointed it out, but he's a social psychologist, not a clinical psychologist. And what should have happened is the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association should have come out 5 years ago and said, you know this whole safe space trigger warning thing? If you were designing a system that would be bad for the mental health of young people, that would be it. And here's the trigger. But they didn't, and they haven't. And that's not good, because there isn't a more fundamental principle that governs psychotherapy towards cure than exposure to what you're afraid of, voluntary exposure to what you're afraid of. And part of the reason for that is that that's actually how you learn. Everyone learns everything that way, right? Well, you know that. If you're going to learn something, the probability that you're going to learn something by confronting a challenge that's somewhat beyond you, and that's going to make you nervous, obviously. And like if the challenge isn't beyond you, then you're not going to learn anything because you already know it, because otherwise it would be beyond you. And if it isn't beyond you enough to make you anxious, then it's not very beyond you. So you make progress in life in trepidation, right? And then the way that you manage that is not to shrink away and hide and build a wall, and that doesn't help anyways, because everything comes up inside the wall anyways, and the tighter the walls and the more you hide, the smaller you get. And so that's a bad strategy. And so unless you want to make small people who are hidden behind walls, maybe so they won't leave you, and that's the Oedipal secret, right? That's the Freudian Oedipal secret. Weaken your children and they won't leave you, right? And then you won't have to have your own life and rely on yourself. And then you can consider yourself ultimately necessary. There's all sorts of other pathologies that are associated with that are as ugly as you can possibly imagine, and perhaps even more ugly. That's the whole bloody Freudian nightmare, and it's a real thing, that's for sure. So instead, what do? Well, when something emerges that sets you back on your heels, you put yourself together and you advance courageously. And it doesn't mean that you don't think there's danger. That just makes you stupid or naive. That's not helpful. You advance despite the fact that there's danger. So one of the things that I've done with my clinical clients quite frequently, they went through this transformation process. First they were naive, and so they thought everyone was good, including them. That's not helpful, because people are good, but they're also not good at all. And so that's half the story. You don't want to know half the story, you want to know the whole story. And so people have a marked proclivity towards good and a marked proclivity towards evil, and you need to know both of those things. And so naive people think that people are good. That makes them open and trusting, but it doesn't make them moral and courageous, because if you're naive, if you're open and trusting because you don't know you can get hurt, that's not a moral virtue, that just means you're naive. And so what happens if you're naive is that someone will betray you. That's for sure. And if it isn't someone that you need, it's yourself. And it doesn't matter, because then your naivety will come tumbling down, and then you'll feel betrayed, and then you won't be able to trust people. And so what's strange about that, so then you're nihilistic and cynical, and maybe you're depressed and anxious as well. And that's actually better than being naive, even though it's a lot more unpleasant. But even though it's better, and you might feel morally superior to the naive people. It's like, look at you think butter wouldn't melt in your mouth. You think people are good. I know better. I've had contact with the world. Terrible things have happened to me. And now I know. It's like, yeah, but you're halfway there at that point. Like, you've gone down, but you haven't come back up, because the next thing is, so, my clients would tell me, say, well, I've been terribly betrayed in my love life. Why should I ever find anyone to trust? How am I ever going to trust anyone again? Well, that's a great question. It's like, well, you might be betrayed, so how can I tell you to trust someone? Well, I can't trust people because they're not trustworthy. It's like, yeah, true. So maybe there's another reason to trust people. You trust people because you're courageous, not because they're trustworthy. And what's so interesting about that is that that's past naivety and past nihilism. It's back up to something else. It's like, I know perfectly well that you're just as full of snakes as me. Nonetheless, I'm going to hold up my hand and say, well, let's move forward together. And if I'm able to do that with a certain amount of faith and courage, then the probability that will work is instantly magnified, right? Because if you do, for most people, despite their tenuous positioning on the continuum between good and evil, if you hold out a hand to them and meet them in the best of all possible places, then you increase the probability that they will respond in kind. And that definitely works. And so you overcome the probability of betrayal with courage, not naivety. And that's part of voluntarily facing the world. And it's the same with your fears. There's plenty to be afraid of. There's more to be afraid of even than you think, right? I mean, because life is a fatal game, and you're all in. And so everything there is to be afraid of is there. You might say, well, how can you possibly cope with that? And the idea would be, well, let's build a wall around things. It's like, well, no, everything comes in under the wall. It's not helpful. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be borders between things. This isn't an argument that's naive. That's not my point. My point is that you overcome fear not with safety, but with courage. And that's rule one, right? To stand up straight with your shoulders back. That's what that whole chapter is about. It's not about developing power so you can take your place in the tyrannical patriarchy. First of all, power isn't the most reliable means to acquiring position in a functional hierarchy. It's competence that's the best practice if you want to acquire position in a hierarchy, unless the hierarchy is corrupt, and our hierarchies aren't that corrupt. They're kind of corrupt, except compared to every other hierarchy everywhere else that's ever been created. So, well, it's an important distinction. One of the things that I find absolutely appalling about the modern universities is their failure to evince any gratitude whatsoever. It's like, well, what we have around us is flawed in an indefinite number of ways, but compared to what exactly? Like, what are you comparing it to? The way things were 50 years ago? It's better. The way things were 120 years ago? It's incomparably better. The way things are in most places in the world? Well, go somewhere else and find out. How many countries in the world are places where people, given their free choice, would move to? Like 30? And there's 200 countries? So, yeah, we've got a corruption problem and we have a patriarchy problem because our structures tend towards tyranny just like every other structure. But, for flawed creatures in a flawed world, we're not doing so bad. And a little gratitude for that wouldn't be such a terrible thing. Back to the equality idea, all created equal. Well, I said that one of the hallmarks of equality is everyone's propensity for malevolence. And I like that argument because it's believable. And so it's good to start with a believable argument. If you want a foundation, because I opened this whole talk saying, well, let's see if we can find a foundation. It's like, we're all capable of evil. Argue yourself out of that. Good luck. And it's deep. And you think, well, Jesus, that's a hell of a negative foundation. What do you do with that? It's like, no, it's not. That's not it exactly. There's another idea, and this goes along with facing what you fear. So you face what you fear, and you get stronger. Well, what are you most afraid of, or what's most horrifying? Well, it might be the infinite abyss of malevolence, right? I mean, that's about as bad as it gets. What happens when you face that? Well, that's when you find the other part of the equality argument, the equal, that all men are created equal. It's like, although we have that capacity for malevolence, we have the ability to transcend it. We have the ability to confront it, just like we have the ability to confront our fears. And so what I've become convinced of by studying malevolence for decades, as seriously as I could, is that the capacity for good is more powerful than the capacity for evil. Because if we can confront our fear, and if we can confront our malevolence voluntarily, then we can discover what's in us that allows us to transcend that. And then you think, well, imagine that there's something that's absolutely terrible, a dragon, a fire-breathing dragon. It's the worst thing you could possibly imagine. Well, what's more powerful than that? And that's easy. Whatever can defeat it. And so if the terror and the malevolence are fundamental realities, then anything that can defeat that is a more fundamental reality. And so one of the things I've become convinced of is that with sufficient courage and faith, then we can find within ourselves what's necessary to overcome malevolence, no matter how deeply rooted that malevolence is. There's something in us that can move in the opposite direction and emerge victorious over that. And so it's so perverse, because out of the worst study, let's say, the study of the worst thing, then the best thing emerges. I figured out 3 weeks ago, there's this old idea that you can rescue your dead father from the belly of the beast. You see that in Pinocchio, for example, and you all take it for granted when you watch that movie, that it makes sense. And it does, but you don't know why. It's because if you face the thing that's most terrifying, then you can extract what's best out of it. And that's a lovely thing to know. I mean, that's a real optimistic view of courage. It's like, things are terrible, and maybe they're even worse than you think, including you. But regardless of how deep that abyss is, there's something that you can use that's real, more real than anything else, to put that at bay. And that's the rest of the story of equal before God. That's the other part of it. And then that's the optimistic part. So then think about that. So look, your society, my society as well, your society is predicated on the idea that each of us is a cornerstone, not only of the state, but of being itself. But let's just say of the state, right? You're all sovereign individuals. The integrity of the state rests on your shoulders. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the right to vote. That's one of your rights, right? You have the rights of a sovereign individual. Well, do you or not? Well, you act it out. You treat each other that way. You demand the rights. Maybe you don't go with the corresponding responsibility, but you certainly demand the rights. You're very annoyed when you don't get them. It looks like you believe it. So what are you believing exactly? Well, you're believing something like, well, there's enough to you so that you can be validly construed as the foundational cornerstone of the state. And what that means is that the state's integrity depends on you. And well, what does that mean? Well, it must mean that there's something more to you than meets the eye, because otherwise that would be a pretty stupid idea, wouldn't it? If we're all useless creatures, fundamentally speaking, if we were a dime a dozen or a dime a billion, and there was nothing to us intrinsically, if we had no intrinsic worth, that self-evident worth, well, then it would be if none of that existed, it would be perfectly preposterous to presume that you had the right to vote and that the integrity of the state depended on the integrity of your choices. But that's the other thing that I learned when I was studying totalitarianism, is that takes us back to the beginning of the lecture as well. It's like, states degenerate into hell when people start to act like devils. And that's the right level of analysis. It's like, is the state everything it should be? No. Are you? No. Well, then fix that. Because you're the cornerstone of the state. It's the fundamental presupposition of your culture. It's one of the self-evident truths. In fact, it's the self-evident truth. It's like, it's a horrifying truth because it places a tremendous amount of responsibility on you. But then I'll close with this. But here's something cool, as far as I can tell. And this is part of this deep self-evidence as well. There's an idea. I was just reading the Gospel of Matthew today, and I came across a section where Christ tells his disciples to pick up their cross and follow him. It's very interesting. This is obviously before the crucifixion. It's very interesting. And then I was in Australia a while back, and I went to this Orthodox cathedral, and there was an interesting triptych there, so that's a three-part painting. And in the middle of the painting, there was a picture of Christ stepping upstairs to a cross and inviting people along, which is, think about that image anthropologically. It's like, what the hell does that mean? What is that? What is that idea? It's like, accept your damn suffering and transcend it. That's what it means. It works. That's what that means. And so, and that's part and parcel of this self-evidence, you know? It's terrifying to think that you might be the locus of the stability of the state, but that's what we've decided. That's what we've died for in wars, that idea to preserve it. That's what we believe when we say, well, we're all sovereign individuals of intrinsic value. There's supposed to be something fundamental about that. It's why the legal system can't just run roughshod over you, right? Even if you're a murderer, there's things the state can't do to you because of your intrinsic value. What could that be, that intrinsic value? And if it's there, it's got to be something pretty damn profound. If it can even trump murder, well, it is the case. You know, you have no option. You can choose evil or you can choose good. And if you choose good, then you stabilize the state. Or at least if you resist evil, that's at least something. You stabilize the state. And so I've been going around to people talking, well, my students first for a very long time, about this very idea that there's more to us than we think. And that's part of the self-evidence. That's part of the self-evident foundation upon which our culture is predicated. The notion that each individual is of inviolable value. And that that's actually true. And it's not true in sort of a game-like way. It's true because it's literally and metaphorically and spiritually and psychologically the case that the integrity and stability of the state depends on the ethical choices you make as an individual. And that's on you. And then, here's the cool part of that. And then it goes along with this idea of voluntarily accepting suffering. It's like, you know, people pursue happiness. That's one of your unalienable rights. And I'm not so sure that the pursuit of happiness is a good thing, but if you get it, well, more power to you. But I think that it's very necessary to pursue meaning. That's rule 7, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. And here's the idea. It's like, life is a catastrophe, it's a tragedy, and it's tainted by malevolence, and everyone knows that. And you're all in, and it's a fatal game, and you need a reason to play it properly, right? You need something to buttress yourself against that tragedy and catastrophes. Well, what do you have to do that? Well, you have meaning. You have a sense of meaning and commitment and purpose. I could say, well, where are you going to find that? You're not going to find that exactly in your rights. You're going to find that in your responsibilities. And you think about this in your own life. Like, you think about what makes your life meaningful when the chips are down, or even when they're not. It's when you've taken on a burden that you believe is worth carrying. You think then you can look at yourself in the mirror with some degree of self-respect, even when things are collapsing around you. You think, well, maybe the degree to which you can invest in life is proportional to the degree that you're willing to take responsibility for it. And that's the whole bloody catastrophe, right? That's malevolence and tragedy. You think, I'm going to confront that. I'm going to take that on, and I'm going to constrain the malevolence, and I'm going to work to rectify the tragedy to the degree that's possible. And that's my noble goal in life. And what's so interesting about that is that it's an instant antidote to the suffering. Because then you have something worth doing. It's like, it's really worth doing. You know, it's worth getting up in the morning when you're not feeling so damn well. And maybe it's worth not having that 10th drink for. You know, it's worth making some sacrifices for. And you have some meaning that imbues your life. And that's one of the things that also stabilizes you as part of the bedrock of the state. And all of that seems to me to be true. You know, and it's interesting because now I've traveled many, many places, and I've spoken with thousands and thousands of people, and many people have told me that they've been watching my lectures and reading my book, and they've been trying to tell the truth, and they've been trying to take on more responsibility, and as a consequence, their lives are inconceivably better. Not that they're necessarily good, you know, because your life can be really terrible and be inconceivably better than it was and still not be that good. But it's better, and the trajectory is good. Well, so I'm hoping, you know, in these times of unparalleled change, when we have an unbroken expanse of possibility in front of us, with everything we're able to do technologically, you know, we can reshape the world in the next 50 years in whatever way we choose. We can get rid of hunger. The UN has already projected that by the year 2030, given the current rate of economic expansion, there won't be a single person in the world who meets present-day criteria for absolute poverty. We could do, right? 18 years. It's not very long. It's a generation. It's nothing. It's as fast as you could hope that it could possibly be done. You know, and there are people who are winning the war on terrible diseases. And God only knows how good we could make things. And I would say, well, and that's what we should do, and we're in a bit of a crisis of confidence in the West right now, and that's really a problem, because we're at a crisis of confidence just at the point where the principles that we laid out are being played out in most of the world and working. And so I'm hoping, well, we can go back down to the bottom of things and discover what we've lost, and to put our foundation back in place, and to, from that perspective, position, develop the courageous wherewithal to adopt as much responsibility as we possibly can as unique individuals, and that as a consequence of that we'll tilt everything towards the good and away from the catastrophe. And I truly believe that if enough people do that, then, or maybe even if one person does it well enough, who knows how these things work, that will be the result, and that's within our grasp. And so that's a good place to stop. So thank you.
Can you guys do this again tomorrow night? Is that possible?
I'll stay here for
I have
that.
a feeling. All right, so we're going to do a little Q&A. You guys submitted a ton of questions here. This is actually Jordan's computer that I have right here, and I have the password. He's on Twitter right now. I could end it all. That's a lot of power, you know what I'm saying? I'll bring it out instead. Jordan Peterson. So real quick, before we get to the questions, there was a line that I have not heard you say in all the shows that we've done that I really love tonight. This concept of imagine the worst thing you can, a fire-breathing dragon. And that you immediately can imagine something better than that. That's pretty powerful. That's really giving them something to walk away
Let me tell you
with.
a story about that.
I
So
thought you might have a story about
this
it.
is a cool story, man. This happened. There's even witnesses. So, credible ones.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. It's on
I
there.
don't know why you're all laughing about that. So I went to my sister-in-law's house about 25 years ago, and her marriage was sort of shaky for a variety of reasons. And she had a son, my nephew, he was a very smart little kid. And he was running around with a night hat, you know, and a little plastic sword. And he'd just zip around during the day with this night hat and his plastic sword, and it was quite cute. But at the same time, he was suffering from night terrors. And so that's a childhood psychological condition. And what happens if you have night terrors is you wake up screaming, and you know, your mother or someone close to you will come in and ask you what's wrong, and usually you can't remember, but the logical assumption is nightmare or something like that. So I was kind of watching what was happening in the background in the household, and he was going off to kindergarten, and like I said, the marriage was shaky, and so he had his reasons to be unstable, right? There were things going on that were lurking beneath the surface. So anyways, we were there one night, and my wife and I, and he woke up screaming, and his mom went in and calmed him down. He went back to sleep, and then the next morning, I asked him, "Did you have any dreams?" And he said, "Yes." And he got this really intense look on his face, you know. And everyone shut up. We were all sitting for breakfast, and we just shut up because he was you could see that something had gripped him, and so everyone was watching him. And he said, "Yes, I dreamt that I was out in the field, and there was all these little creatures out in the field. They were like dwarfs, except they had beaks. They had big beaks, and they only came up to my knees, but they were covered with hair. They didn't have any arms, and they had big, powerful legs, and they were covered with hair and grease, and they had crosses shaded in the top of their head. And everywhere I went, they would jump with their beaks and bite me." And Well, everybody knew why he was having night terrors at that point. And he said, and then it was worse. In the background, there was this giant dragon, and it was breathing out fire and smoke. And every time it breathed out more smoke, then the smoke would turn into these, like, dwarfs. And I thought, oh, that's so amazing. That's such an amazing dream. Because what it meant was, so he was being plagued by small anxieties, let's say. Not trivial ones. These were still like big things, right? But they only came up to his knees, but they could hop and bite him, so they were damaging. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that there was something in the background that generated these things. So imagine this. The problem isn't that there are things to be afraid of. The problem is that things that can be afraid of, that you can be afraid of, can be generated. It's a worse fear, right? It's not that you're afraid of something, it's that things that you're afraid of exist and multiply. That's way worse than just that there's something to be afraid of. And so if you really wanted to solve the problem of fear, you wouldn't worry about the specific thing you're afraid of. You'd go after the source of fear itself. And that's what human beings have been trying to figure out how to do ever since we became self-conscious, is to go after the source of fear itself. We don't kill snakes, we take the nests out, right? So we don't sit in our burrows and wait to be attacked. We go out there and we find out what it is that could take us out, and we take it out. Right? And then that's a psychological issue too, not just a practical issue. So I thought, well, that's the Hydra. It's the same story. You cut off a Hydra's head, 7 more heads grow. It's like, well, there's no sense fighting these big dwarfs, because what about the dragon? So yeah, what about the damn dragon? That's for sure. What about the dragon? So I said, what could you do about that? And you see, that's called leading the witness. You think that's a question. It's like, no, it's not a question. It's a suggestion and a question. Because inside the question, there are things that are held as self-evident. And one of the things that I was holding as self-evident was that he was the sort of creature who could do something about that. Right? And so then he got all even more excited. He said, well, I get my hat and I get my sword and I take my dad. And then we go after the dragon and we go right down his throat to the box where the fire came out, and we carve out a piece of the box and kill the dragon and make a shield, and that would be that. And I thought, God, that's so brilliant, so unbelievably brilliant. Well, think about it. So first of all, you don't bother with the damn dwarfs, because there's more where they came from. You go right to what you're most terrified of, and you go right down into hell. Right? And then by doing that, you gain something. And what you gain is a shield. It's made out of the firebox itself. That was his insight. And then he said, I jump up at the dragon's head and I poke out its eyes with my sword. And then I go down its stomach to where the fire came out. And I make a shield out of the firebox. I thought, that's absolute. You think, see, that's a great example of how what we know is nested inside a story. It's nested inside what we don't know. He was practicing that during the day, running around like a knight. It's like, what's a knight? Well, he's a knight. He's off for the search for the Holy Grail. He's trying to fight evil. He's like the Prince Charming in Snow White that confronts the terrible dragon with truth and courage, and then gains the maiden, by the way. And so that's what he was trying to figure out. I'm a knight. Well, but it wasn't quite catalyzed. He needed someone to say, what could you do about it? It's like, oh, I could do something about it. I would take my dad. That's the rescuing of the father, right? Tradition. I take my tradition. That would strengthen me enough to confront what's most terrifying. And I'll gain something out of that that will be a permanent redemptive utility. And that was the end of his night terrors. And I know you think, well, that's too good to be true. It's like, really? Yes, really. I followed up with his mom. Because I was curious as to what the consequence of this would be, the fact that this had been catalyzed in him. And it's not like he never had any problems for the rest of his life, or any of that, but he lived happily ever after. It's the right story. He had his problems, but that went away. And it's because, at least at some level, he started to understand that he was more powerful. His willingness to confront the fear was more powerful than the fear itself. The willingness to confront fear is more powerful than fear. The willingness to confront malevolence is more powerful than malevolence, and those things are true. It's true.
All right, so on Slido, people thumb up questions. This one had by far the most thumbs up. Would you ever be willing to read the Book of Mormon and analyze it? And analyze
Get through
it
the
in a
Bible
way
first.
similar to what you've done with the Bible?
Well, look. You think about how many books there are out there that guide people's lives that would be usefully subjected to that treatment, and then you think about how little time any one person has. You know, I would like to get through the biblical stories, and, you know, it took me 2 hours to get through the first sentence of Genesis, so I'm hoping that I can return to Exodus in September. That's the plan at the moment. And I would like to go through as much of that as I can, and then there's other books that I would like to do the same thing with, but it's just so unlikely that I'll be able to get to that, because I don't think I'll get through what I want to do already, so it's not like it wouldn't be a worthwhile endeavor, but it's outside of the realm of likely possibility. So
there were a bunch of these. A lot of people wanted you to clarify your tweet about Cavanaugh.
oh yeah, okay. Well, I'll clarify it in two ways. The first thing is that I promised my son about a month ago that I wouldn't make casual statements on Twitter, that what I would do is write a blog post. And I should have. I mean, Eric Weinstein had posted a Twitter saying, well, we don't know what to do because we're kind of screwed both ways at the moment. You know, if Cavanaugh is taken out, you know, this was obviously before it looked like he was going to win the nomination or be approved. That only became clear in about the last 3 days. And so I was trying to put myself in Cavanaugh's position, thinking, okay, well, if he was a client of mine, what would I recommend? And I thought, well, it's very tricky. It's very difficult to put myself in someone's position like that. But I thought, well, the problem is he can't just withdraw, because his life is over if he withdraws. Okay, and then if he gets the nomination, well, then what? Well, then he's cleared, at least, as cleared as he's ever going to get, which is not entirely cleared, which is unfortunate, because the possibility that he can be entirely cleared is off the table. That's not going to happen. So he's in a position where he's being compromised. That's it. His reputation has been compromised. And this is completely independent of what he's done. I have no idea what he's done. Who the hell knows what happened 35 years ago? I've worked on court cases where people made accusations 40 years in the past. Man, and you think today is murky, you should try looking 40 years ago and see how murky that is. It's really... So then I thought, well, let's say he gets approved. But then what? You know, like I read today, for example, NBC News, this was their coverage. There's already 153,000 signatures on in a petition that's hypothetically sponsored by the Democrats, if I remember correctly. They're a fragmented group, so God only knows what that means. Well, so are the Republicans. It's not like it's a homogenous group. It's like, you know, there's crazy Republicans and there's crazy Democrats, and so it's hard to tell what that means, but there's already 153,000 signatures calling for his impeachment. You know, and I was thinking, well, if I put myself in Cavanaugh's position, which I can do to some degree, because people have gone after my reputation in every bloody way, almost every way you can think of. Not every way. There's still ways they haven't. But lots of ways. And I thought, well, if the goal is peace, let's say, maybe the best possible outcome would be for Cavanaugh to get confirmed and then to withdraw, on the hope that they could put another candidate in place who's as conservative, so there'd be no loss on the political front, but so that maybe the next nomination process wouldn't be of a sort that leaves the whole structure of the judiciary subject to permanent partisan dispute. Now, so I thought, well, maybe we could have our cake and eat it too. He could be cleared because there's insufficient evidence to pursue him. He could still have his life. We could bring another conservative candidate on board. We, you know, I mean everyone, you could bring another conservative candidate on board, the Supreme Court could be filled, and some of the tension with regards to the polarized political system could be rectified. So that was my thinking, and like, I couldn't explain. I said a sentence that was stupid because I kind of thought that some of that would be self-evident, but of course it wasn't. And it was just foolishness, on my part. I should have known that wouldn't be self-evident. So I explained it some more today in the sequence of tweets, but that was the idea. And, people said, no, that's wrong because if you let the accusers knock you out of the race, then they win, and all that does is embolden them, and you should know better than that because you have told people not to withdraw, and look, fair enough, man. I mean, I don't know what the hell is the right way out of this mess. I mean, I don't see a clear path forward out of this. What I see now is that, I don't like the believe the accuser philosophy. I think that's an appalling philosophy. You have to be naive beyond comprehension to think that that's a good idea, to think that people wouldn't misuse. If that was the rule, every accuser is right. Oh, that's a great rule. That is. I'm not willing to give up the presumption of innocence or the idea that it's better to let, 10 guilty people walk free than to convict one innocent person. That's a good bloody rule. That's a good rule. And we don't just give that rule up because we're feeling all empathic and morally superior about it. So, but we've got a problem, and the problem is that I don't see any way of moving this forward without exacerbating the polarized tension. Now, some of the people who objected to what I said, well, bring on the tension. Maybe we need to play this out thoroughly, rather than making premature peace. It's like, look, could be. I can't tell. It was just, I was trying to think of some way that might work out in the relatively short term for everyone concerned. And it seemed to me that it would be something for Cavanaugh to consider because he would have got the nomination. So at this stage, that's a feather in his hat. It's a crumpled feather and it's a dirty hat because it's been such a bloody mess, but it's not nothing. It means he could walk away without being killed by this. That would be something. And maybe you could make a case that if he was acting, you could make a case that one way of acting in a patriotic manner, although not necessarily the only way, would be to sacrifice his personal ambition and allow another candidate to step in his place. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that was, Jesus, just because you think something doesn't mean it's right. I was trying to puzzle this through, and that's another possible pathway.
I think the short answer is Twitter sucks.
Well,
all right, let's change gears a little bit. Did you have a nice day in Utah?
I had a great day in Utah. Except for the whole driving up into winter thing, it was beautiful. Like, it's beautiful here. And I went and looked at Temple Square. I didn't go in because it was, well, for a variety of reasons, didn't really have time. And there was a lot of people there. But I drove around downtown and then we drove out in the country, and so that was beautiful. And this is great. This is Lovely Hall, and look at all you people. And so that's wonderful. All these lectures are great, as far as I'm concerned. I don't mean because I'm doing them, but because of what's happening, as far as I can tell. It's so interesting to see. These are serious lectures, or at least they're as serious as I can manage them. And it's not like I'm pandering to the crowd, telling you all that you're basically Nazis, Of course, I'm including myself in that category, which makes me different than most of the people who are telling you that you're Nazis. But it's been very heartening to see that there's this immense public hunger for serious discourse. It's way broader than anybody suspected, and I really love doing this tour. We move from town to town on a daily basis, and it's nerve-wracking to speak to so many people. And I try to give a different talk every night, although the themes repeat. And And so I'm always apprehensive. I think that's probably right. I'm always apprehensive. And there's lots of things going on in the background around me that are stressful. But this is unbelievably worthwhile as far as I'm concerned. And so it's a very nice ending to a very good day. So.
In your clinical practice, did you ever have a client that you could not help?
Yes. In the final analysis, one person really sticks in my mind. This was someone who was a very good guy, and he got tangled up in the family court system. He was undergoing a very messy divorce, to someone who wasn't helpful in the least, to say the least. And I worked with him for about 4 years, and he did, I'm not going to say he did everything I told him to do, because that isn't how it works in therapy. If you have any sense, what you do is you speak with your client, and you strategize, and you come to a mutually negotiated plan, and then you implement that, and then you see if it works, and if it doesn't, you modify it. But you don't impose a plan on your client. That's really stupid, because that's predicated on the assumption that you know what that person should do, and you don't know what anyone else should do. You might be able to listen to them and help them figure out what they should do, and tentatively come up with a strategy and all that. But anyways, we would generate plans, and he would implement them to the letter. And lots of the things we did, like I helped him figure out how to toilet train his kids, and helped him figure out how disciplinary strategies with his kids, and how to exchange his kids with his ex-wife without being arrested and thrown in jail. So while we ended up, he would only pick up his kids in front of the supermarket during a busy time. She would drive up in a van, he would pull in behind her, he would go into the supermarket and look through the plate glass window. She would put the kids in the car, she would leave, and then he would go out and drive away, because he wanted to stay 100 feet away from her at all times, so that there wasn't any possibility that she could accuse him of misbehavior. So anyways, the court system destroyed him. It just took him apart piece by piece. And I did everything I could to help him. And we couldn't do it. So that was seriously ugly. And he wanted his kids 50% of the time. And that's impossible, basically, in the court system, the way it's set up now. So it was really ugly. So that was sad. So, yeah.
Do we actually live in unique times, or does it just feel like it?
Both.
Well, that's a hard question, because in some sense, every time is unique, but having said that, you still have the sense that sometimes are more unique than others. Well, I think we're in another situation of crisis. And a crisis is both spectacular opportunity and spectacular potential for catastrophe. And I do think we're in one of those periods right now. I think a huge part of it is a consequence of insane technological progress. Because we've become so powerful. We're so powerful. And we're struggling to be as responsible as we are powerful. It's really hard, because we're becoming more and more powerful very, very rapidly. And ramping up the degree of responsibility that's necessary to allow that to be wielded properly is no simple matter. So, but you never know. Maybe we can manage it. I mean, there's a lot of good things happening. I mentioned already, like the percentage of people in absolute poverty has plummeted insanely quickly over the last 30 years, and to some degree before that. But the rate at which extreme poverty is being eradicated is accelerating. So that's very, very cool. And there's a lot of other things that are happening that are really good too. Like there's more overweight people in the world than there are hungry people now. And so that's a really good thing in a very weird way. There's more forest in the northern hemisphere than there was 100 years ago. There's more forest in China than there was 30 years ago. That's a good thing. Turns out if you get GDP up to about $5,000 per person per year, then people start caring about the environment. So that's really cool because, yeah, that's really something, eh? Because what it might mean is that if we could make everyone rich enough fast enough, then we could balance the planet ecologically. And that would be a lovely thing. Wouldn't it be something if those two things could happen at the same time? Is that the best way to maintain the planet's habitable nature would be to make everyone on the planet rich quick? So it could be that that's the case. I think that's what the data are indicating. We can do a lot more with less on almost every front. You know, part of the reason that there's more forest in the Northern Hemisphere is because a lot of marginal farmland has gone back to forest because we're much better at growing food in a much smaller area. So, you know, and it doesn't look like we're going to die of overpopulation because we're going to peak at about 9 billion by all appearances. And then the population will decline quite rapidly after that. In fact, I think in 100 years, one of the problems will be that there aren't enough people rather than that there are too many. I think that's the most likely outcome. We can easily feed 9 billion people. We're feeding 7 now, and with increasing efficiency. So we're not going to hit a food bottleneck, and everyone thought we were. That turned out to be wrong. You know, and there's no wars in the Western Hemisphere right now. That's the first time since the Europeans came to the New World that there hasn't been a war. So no wars in the Western Hemisphere. That's a pretty good deal. The rate of warfare has plummeted precipitously since the Second World War. So there's far fewer people killed every year in war progressively every year since 1945. You know, it bumps around a little bit, but that's the basic trend. It's the same trend for homicide. There are a lot of good things going on the macro front. You know, I think we could probably knock out the world's 5 worst diseases in the next 20 years. People are going after tuberculosis, which is one we should really hit hard. Malaria is on the run. That's a big deal because it's one of the things that's keeping Africa down in a major way. We just about got rid of polio. We got rid of what the hell's the name of that horrible worm? Guinea worm? One doctor eradicated guinea worm. Don't look guinea worms up. You don't want to know what they are. So, you know, everybody has tremendous technological power in the palm of their hand. Who knows what we can do? So, but we're shaky, especially in the West at the moment, and it's because we've forgotten. We're in a crisis of confidence, and I think it's unwarranted. I think it's unwarranted. There are things we got right. The sovereignty of the individual, that's right. What I told you guys tonight about courage and faith, I truly believe, being a very pessimistic person, and I'm as pessimistic as anybody you would ever possibly meet, I think. Maybe not, because there are some real pessimistic people in the world, but it is the case that the more deeply I looked into what was terrible, the more optimistic I got about what human beings were really like. And so I think we can overcome anything. Who knows what we can overcome? But we have to take on the responsibility. But that's okay, because there's deep significance in responsibility. So it's actually something you should want. You know, it is the case that you can tolerate yourself that's something. You can actually tolerate yourself. No, that's not, you know, it's not all roses and sunshine, that statement, but if you take on this sufficiently noble set of responsibilities and you struggle with them courageously and honorably, then you can accept your own limited falseness and insufficiency. At least you can recognize in yourself someone who's struggling nobly. That's something. It's real too. You know, and a real something is worth it. It's got value. You know, and I know this to be true because, well, as I said, because it's a clinical truism in some sense, but also because of this sort of thing, you know, people know these things to be true. So,
all right, only time for one more. What do you do for fun, Peterson?
well, at the moment, I tread very carefully for fun, I would say. Mostly what I do now, well, my wife travels with me, so that's really helpful. She's here lurking somewhere in the audience.
everyone's looking for. Oh, on the spot.
And so we take our opportunities for fun where we can get them. Like we drove out of town today. I rented a Mustang Corvette or a Mustang
Convertible.
Mustang convertible at the airport. It was a little chilly, but we drove up into the mountains and that was fun. And so we take little bits of break where we can, and that's good. And I spend a lot of, my son just got married, so we were in Halifax for a week, and that was really good. And I like his new wife, thank God. And it's at least somewhat mutual as far as I can tell. And so I spend time with my family. I have a grandchild, and we see her when we can. And most of what's been fun, I haven't had a lot of fun in the last couple of years, I must say, but because things have been, fun is dangerous. And I haven't been in a position where I was willing to risk making any mistakes, because for a very long period of time, and maybe even now, like a mistake is not a good idea at all. So mostly when I am able to get a break, it's usually with my family. I have some close friends as well, and they're good, and I've seen a fair bit of them. So that's the reality of the current situation.
For the record, I had you doing stand-up last night.
That's true. That was fun.
Good time.
That was fun. Yeah, that was fun.
Oh, so we should have known about that.
All right, well, on that note, it's funny, we've been doing these, and after 50 some odd shows, the cities all kind of blend into one thing, but there is no doubt that I, for one, will remember Salt Lake City. So that said, I'm going to get out of the way and make some noise for Dr. Jordan Peterson, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Been a pleasure to be here. Good night.
Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Stand up straight, stand up straight, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Stand up straight, 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 stand up straight with your shoulders back.